The September heat shimmered across the dusty yard of the Wyoming Territory Reform School as Augustus Gus Thornfield approached the forbidding brick building where society sent orphaned children to learn discipline and proper behavior. 59 years old, Gus had built his ranch from nothing through hard work and fair dealing, but what he was about to witness would challenge every assumption he held about human decency and the treatment of defenseless children. Warden Hamilton. Price greeted Gus with the cold efficiency of someone who viewed children as problems to be managed rather than people to be nurtured. His grey uniform and stern demeanour seemed designed to intimidate rather than reassure, and his pale eyes held the calculating coldness of someone who enjoyed having absolute power over the helpless. "Mr. Thornfield, welcome to our institution," Price announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to unquestioned obedience. "I understand you're seeking workers who have been properly conditioned to understand discipline and submission to lawful authority." Gus followed the warden through corridors that echoed with an unnatural silence, noting how children seemed to press themselves against walls when Price appeared. The building felt more like a prison than a school, with its barred windows and the heavy atmosphere of fear that permeated every room. "We pride ourselves on breaking the willful spirit that characterizes most orphan children," Price explained as they walked through a dormitory where dozens of boys sat in absolute silence on hard wooden benches. "Orphans come to us filled with pride and defiance, thinking they deserve the same treatment as legitimate children. We cure them of such delusions." The casual cruelty in Price's voice made Gus's jaw clench with suppressed anger, but he kept his expression neutral as they continued the tour. These children looked broken in ways that went beyond simple obedience. They showed the hollow-eyed emptiness of spirits that had been systematically crushed. "This is our dining facility," Price announced as they entered a large room where children ate in complete silence from metal bowls, their movements mechanical and joyless. "We maintain strict protocols to ensure proper behavior and eliminate the chaos that results from allowing children to think mealtimes are social occasions." Gus noticed that the children ate quickly and defensively, as if afraid their food might be taken away, and that several of the youngest ones showed signs of malnutrition despite being in an institution supposedly charged with their care. "And this," Price said with obvious satisfaction as they moved to another room, "is where we administer corrective treatment for those who struggle to accept proper authority." The punishment room contained devices that made Gus's stomach turn. Restraint chairs, isolation boxes barely large enough for a child to crouch in, and an array of implements designed to inflict pain and terror. But it was what he saw outside the window that made his blood run cold. In the yard behind the building, a boy who couldn't have been more than 11 years old was on his hands and knees beside a wooden water trough, lapping water like an animal, while two guards watched with obvious amusement. "What in God's name is that child doing?" Gus demanded, his careful composure finally cracking at the sight of such degradation. "That's Charlie Morrison," Price replied matter-of-factly, as if describing routine maintenance. 11 years old, arrived here 6 months ago after his parents died in a factory fire. He's been resistant to learning proper respect for authority, so he's receiving enhanced behavioral correction. Gus felt his hands clench into fists as he absorbed the casual explanation of systematic dehumanization. "You're making a child drink from an animal trough. We've found that removing the privilege of eating and drinking like a human being teaches important lessons about earning basic dignities through proper behavior," Price explained, with the tone of someone discussing effective training techniques. "Charlie has been drinking from the trough for 3 days now, and his attitude is already showing marked improvement." The explanation revealed the depth of cruelty that passed for education at the reform school. Children were being systematically stripped of their humanity and taught that basic dignities were privileges to be earned through submission, rather than rights inherent to their existence as human beings. "How long will he be required to continue this treatment?" Gus asked, though he was already planning intervention regardless of the answer. "Until he demonstrates complete acceptance of institutional authority," Price replied with satisfaction. "Some children learn quickly that resistance only brings more discomfort, while others require extended correction to overcome their prideful attitudes." Gus looked out the window again at the boy kneeling beside the water trough, noting the child's thin frame and the defeated slump of his shoulders. Here was a human being who was being systematically taught that he was no better than an animal, that his basic needs for food and water could be used as tools of control and humiliation. "I'd like to speak with Charlie," Gus said quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made Price look at him with sudden wariness. "That's not advisable," Price replied quickly. "Charlie is in the middle of corrective treatment, and outside interference could undermine months of careful conditioning. He needs to understand that his current situation results from his own choices and attitudes." But Gus was already moving toward the door that led to the yard, his decision made with the same moral certainty that had guided him through 30 years of treating all people with basic dignity, regardless of their circumstances. "Mr. Thornfield, I must insist that you not interfere with institutional protocols," Price called after him. But there was uncertainty in his voice that suggested he wasn't entirely confident in his authority over someone who wasn't dependent on the institution's approval. Gus stepped into the yard and approached the water trough, where Charlie Morrison knelt in the dirt, his small hands braced on either side of the wooden container as he bent to lap water that animals had been drinking from. The boy's clothes were dirty and torn, his hair unwashed, and his face bore the hollow expression of someone whose spirit was being systematically broken. "Charlie," Gus said gently, kneeling down beside the boy so they could speak at eye level. "My name is Gus Thornfield. Can you tell me your name, son?" Charlie looked up with eyes that held a mixture of hope and terror, clearly wanting to respond, but afraid of the consequences that adult attention usually brought in his experience. "I'm Charlie Morrison, sir," the boy whispered, his voice hoarse. "From days of being forbidden normal conversation. I'm sorry if I'm not supposed to talk to you. They told me I'm not allowed to speak like a person until I learn to behave like one." The casual repetition of the dehumanizing language that had been drummed into him made Gus's heart break with rage and compassion. Here was a child who was being taught to think of himself as less than human, to accept degradation as appropriate treatment for the crime of being orphaned. "Charlie, you are a person," Gus said firmly, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "You're a valuable, important person who deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of what anyone has told you." The simple validation of his humanity brought tears to Charlie's eyes, though he clearly struggled not to show emotion that might be interpreted as weakness or defiance by the guards who were still watching from a distance. "Sir, they told me I have to drink from the trough because I'm worthless and don't deserve human treatment until I prove I can be obedient," Charlie said quietly. "They said my parents dying was probably God's way of punishing me for being bad." The systematic psychological torture revealed by Charlie's words made Gus understand that what was happening at the reform school went far beyond simple, harsh discipline into deliberate cruelty designed to destroy children's sense of self-worth and human dignity. What happened next became legendary throughout the territory and fundamentally changed how people understood the difference between correction and abuse. Gus Thornfield reached into his coat and withdrew his own personal drinking cup, a simple metal vessel that he had carried for 20 years of ranch work. Without a word, he dipped it into the clean water barrel that stood nearby, filling it with fresh, pure water that no animal had touched. "Charlie," Gus said with quiet ceremony, "I want you to drink from this cup, Not because you've earned the privilege, but because every human being deserves clean water served with dignity." The boy's eyes went wide with amazement and fear as Gus offered him the cup with the same respect he would show to any honored guest. Charlie's hands shook as he accepted it, clearly overwhelmed by being treated as someone worthy of such consideration. "Sir, I don't think I'm allowed," Charlie whispered, glancing nervously toward the guards who were now approaching with obvious anger at the disruption of their authority. "You're allowed because I say you're allowed," Gus replied firmly, "and because no child should ever be forced to drink like an animal when there are adults present who can offer better treatment." Charlie lifted the cup to his lips and drank deeply of the clean water, his eyes never leaving Gus's face as he experienced what may have been the first act of pure kindness he had received since his parents' death. The simple dignity of drinking from a cup rather than lapping from a trough represented a fundamental restoration of his humanity. "That's enough!" Warden Price shouted as he burst into the yard, his face red with fury at seeing his authority challenged so directly. "Mr. Thornfield, you are undermining months of careful behavioral modification. That boy must learn his place before he can be trusted with normal privileges." Gus's response came from deep moral conviction that had been shaped by decades of treating all people, regardless of their age or circumstances, with basic respect. "Mr. Price, that boy's place is as a human being deserving of dignity, not as an animal to be trained through degradation. You don't understand the challenges of managing orphaned children," Price protested, his composure cracking under the weight of public challenge to his methods. "These boys come to us filled with defiance and unrealistic expectations. They must be broken of their pride before they can be rebuilt as useful members of society." "What I understand," Gus replied steadily, "is the difference between education and torture. What you're doing to Charlie isn't teaching him anything, except that adults can't be trusted and that he's worthless. Neither of those lessons will make him a better person or a more productive citizen." As the confrontation intensified, other children began to gather at windows and doorways, drawn by the unprecedented sight of an adult challenging the warden's authority and defending one of their own. For many of them, it was the first time they had seen someone stand up for a child's basic dignity. "Charlie," Gus said, turning back to the boy while keeping his voice loud enough for everyone present to hear, "I want you to remember what happened here today. You drank from a cup because you're a human being who deserves to be treated like one. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The weeks following Gus Thornfield's intervention at the Wyoming Territory Reform School had created a firestorm of controversy that reached the territorial capital and beyond. Word of his simple act, offering clean water in a cup to a boy forced to drink like an animal, had spread through communities where similar institutions operated, raising uncomfortable questions about the treatment of orphaned children throughout the American West. Gus had used his legal standing as a potential employer to secure temporary custody of Charlie Morrison, removing the boy from immediate danger while broader investigations into institutional practices were conducted. The transformation in Charlie during his first month at the ranch had been remarkable, though Gus understood that healing from systematic dehumanization would require patience and consistent demonstration that adults could be trusted. "Mr. Thornfield, I still can't believe you gave me water in your own cup," Charlie said one morning as they worked together in the ranch house kitchen, the boy's obvious amazement revealing how rare such basic courtesy had been in his young life. "At the reform school, they told us that orphans drinking from human cups would contaminate them for decent people." Gus paused in his preparation of their morning meal to study Charlie's face, noting the gradual return of natural curiosity and the way the boy's defensive wariness was slowly being replaced by cautious trust in adult intentions. "Charlie, there's nothing about being orphaned that makes you less clean, less worthy or less human than anyone else. Gus explained gently. What happened to your parents was a tragedy, not a judgment on your character or worth as a person. The systematic psychological abuse Charlie had endured went beyond simple, harsh discipline into deliberate attempts to convince him that his orphaned status made him fundamentally different from and inferior to other children. Rebuilding his sense of self-worth required not just kind treatment, but active contradiction of the lies he had been taught about his inherent value. Dr. Sarah Bennett says that children who are treated like animals sometimes start to believe they actually are animals, Charlie observed with the thoughtfulness that was emerging under respectful treatment. Dr. Bennett was the territorial physician who had been documenting conditions at various institutions as part of a broader reform movement. Dr. Bennett is right, Gus confirmed. That's why it was so important for you to drink from that cup, not because the water tasted different, but because being offered it with respect reminded you that you're a person who deserves to be treated like one. But their peaceful routine at the ranch was being threatened by legal challenges from those who viewed Gus's intervention as dangerous precedent that could undermine institutional authority throughout the territory. Warden Price and his supporters had launched a campaign to regain control of Charlie, arguing that removing him from corrective treatment would encourage rebellion among other institutionalized children. Mr. Thornfield has undermined months of necessary conditioning, Price had written in formal complaints to territorial officials. The boy was learning important lessons about his place in society and his need to earn basic privileges through proper submission. This interference has taught him to expect treatment he hasn't earned and doesn't deserve. The legal battle that was developing would determine not just Charlie's fate, but the future of orphan care policies throughout the Western Territories. Child welfare reformers saw Gus's case as an opportunity to challenge systematic abuse, while institutional operators viewed it as a threat to their authority and economic interests. Gus, you're in for a real fight, warned Judge William Hayes, who had ridden out to the ranch to discuss the legal situation. Price has powerful political connections, and there's a lot of money involved in maintaining the current system. They're going to use every legal mechanism available to force Charlie back into institutional custody. The confrontation that would test everything Gus and Charlie had built together came when a territorial inspector arrived to evaluate whether Charlie was receiving appropriate moral instruction under Gus's care. Inspector Theodore Blackwell had built his reputation on maintaining institutional discipline and was clearly skeptical of approaches that prioritized kindness over harsh conditioning. Mr. Thornfield, I'm here to assess whether this boy is receiving proper preparation for his role in society, Blackwell announced as he studied Charlie with disapproving eyes. Reports suggest you've been allowing him to forget his place and expect treatment above his station. Gus felt his protective instincts sharpen as he noted how Charlie immediately became tense and withdrawn in the inspector's presence, his body language reverting to the defensive postures he had learned at the reform school. Inspector Blackwell, Charlie receives the same moral instruction as any child in my care, Gus replied calmly. He's learning responsibility, work skills, and basic education through example and guidance rather than through punishment and degradation. That's precisely the problem, Blackwell replied with obvious disapproval. This boy needs to understand that orphans must earn basic dignities through demonstrated submission and obedience. Treating him like a normal child creates unrealistic expectations about his place in the social order. The philosophical divide revealed by Blackwell's comments went to the heart of competing approaches to human worth and social organization. He represented the belief that social status determined treatment, while Gus advocated for inherent human dignity regardless of circumstances. Inspector, Would you like to see what Charlie has accomplished since leaving the reform school? Gus offered, gesturing toward the various projects the boy had been working on around the ranch. What Blackwell witnessed during his evaluation clearly surprised him. The child who had been drinking from animal troughs just weeks earlier was now thriving as he learned genuine skills through work assignments that respected his intelligence and developmental needs. Charlie had discovered a natural aptitude for animal care, developing gentle techniques for handling livestock that impressed even experienced ranch hands. His patient approach with injured or frightened animals revealed the compassion that institutional abuse had tried unsuccessfully to crush. Charlie's developed quite a talent for veterinary work, Gus explained, as they watched the boy carefully tend to a horse with an infected hoof. His gentle manner and careful observation skills make him invaluable for maintaining healthy livestock. The boy had also thrown himself into academic learning with the hunger of someone who had been systematically denied education. His natural intelligence, nearly destroyed by institutional conditioning that taught him he was incapable of learning, was flowering under tutoring that recognized his potential. Reading was forbidden at the reform school, Charlie explained to Blackwell, with the confidence that was gradually replacing his earlier fearfulness. They said orphans didn't need book learning, just enough training to follow orders. But Mr. Thornfield says education is what separates humans from animals. The comment revealed both Charlie's growing understanding of his own worth and the deliberate ignorance that institutional systems had tried to maintain. Keeping orphan children illiterate ensured they would remain dependent on whatever opportunities their keepers chose to provide, but it was Charlie's emotional development that most clearly demonstrated the difference between Gus's approach and institutional methods. The boy, who had been taught to see himself as less than human, was learning to articulate his thoughts, express his feelings, and advocate for his own needs with appropriate respect for others. "The most important thing Mr. Thornfield taught me," Charlie told Blackwell during his private interview, "is that I don't have to earn the right to be treated like a person. That's something I have just because I am one." Inspector Blackwell's evaluation took most of the day, during which he tested not just Charlie's academic progress and work skills, but his attitudes toward authority, social hierarchy, and future expectations. What he discovered clearly challenged his preconceptions about orphan management and institutional necessity. "The boy seems well-adjusted and appropriately respectful," Blackwell admitted reluctantly during his conference with Gus. "His work output is impressive, and he shows none of the rebellious attitude I was led to expect from someone who had been, as Warden Price puts it, corrupted by excessive kindness." "That's because kindness doesn't corrupt children, Inspector," Gus replied. "It allows their natural goodness to emerge. Charlie was never broken or defective. He was just being treated in ways that made it impossible for him to show his real character." The critical test came when Blackwell decided to recreate the drinking situation that had originally brought Gus's intervention. He wanted to see whether Charlie had maintained appropriate humility or had developed what institutional operators called unrealistic expectations about his treatment. "Boy," Blackwell said to Charlie with deliberate harshness, "show me how you would properly request water if you were thirsty." Charlie's response revealed both his growth under Gus's care and his understanding of appropriate respect for legitimate authority. Instead of the cringing submission he would have shown at the reform school, he demonstrated the dignity that came from knowing his own worth. "Sir, I would ask politely if I could have a drink of water, and I would thank whoever provided it," Charlie replied clearly. "Mr. Thornfield taught me that being respectful doesn't mean thinking I'm worthless, and being grateful doesn't mean accepting degradation." The wisdom in Charlie's answer impressed even Blackwell, who had expected to find either excessive deference or inappropriate defiance. Instead, he encountered a child who understood both his own dignity and his obligations to treat others with respect. What happened next demonstrated the transformative power of Gus's intervention in ways that went far beyond one boy's recovery. Without being asked, Gus filled his own cup with clean water and offered it to Charlie with the same ceremony he had shown at the reform school. But this time, Charlie accepted it with quiet confidence rather than fearful amazement, understanding that such treatment was appropriate rather than exceptional. "Thank you, Mr. Thornfield," Charlie said after drinking, then turned to offer the cup to Inspector Blackwell. "Would you like some water, sir? It's clean and cold." The gesture of sharing rather than hoarding, of offering hospitality even to someone who had been testing his worthiness, revealed the character that respectful treatment had allowed to flourish. Charlie had learned not just to accept dignity, but to extend it to others. Inspector Blackwell's final report would later become a landmark document in territorial child welfare policy, acknowledging that respectful treatment produced better citizens than systematic degradation. But the immediate impact was legal validation of Gus's guardianship and protection from forced return to institutional abuse. "Mr. Thornfield," Blackwell said as he prepared to leave the ranch, "you've demonstrated that alternative approaches to orphan care can be remarkably effective. This boy is receiving better preparation for adult citizenship than I've seen at most institutional facilities." As the legal crisis passed and Charlie's future at the ranch was secured, Gus reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. What had begun with offering water in a cup had grown into something much larger. Proof that treating children with basic human dignity produced individuals capable of extending that same dignity to others. How will Charlie use his restored dignity to help other children? What lasting impact will Gus's simple act of offering water in a cup have on their community? Subscribe to our channel to witness the incredible ripple effects of treating every child as worthy of basic human respect. The autumn of 1888 brought visitors from across the American territories to witness what child welfare advocates were calling the Thornfield transformation, the remarkable development of Charlie Morrison from a boy forced to drink like an animal into a confident young advocate for orphaned children's rights whose testimony was influencing policy changes throughout the West. Standing in the parlor of his ranch house, Gus Thornfield watched with deep satisfaction as 12-year-old Charlie addressed a gathering of territorial legislators, child welfare reformers, and institutional administrators who had come to study their approach to orphan care and development. "Honorable gentlemen," Charlie said with the poise that had replaced his earlier terror of adult attention, "I want you to understand that when you force children to drink from animal troughs, you're not teaching them humility or proper respect. You're teaching them that they're not worthy of being treated as human beings." The articulate intelligence that Charlie displayed in his testimony revealed how completely institutional conditioning had failed to break his essential spirit. Under Gus's patient guidance, the boy who had been taught he was worthless had developed into a thoughtful advocate whose experiences gave him unique authority to speak about the treatment of society's most vulnerable members. "The difference between correction and cruelty," Charlie continued, his young voice carrying clearly through the crowded room, "is whether the goal is to help children become better people or just to make them easier to control through fear and degradation." Dr. Margaret Sinclair, the prominent child welfare reformer whose documentation of institutional abuses had helped build support for legislative changes, took careful notes as Charlie spoke. His testimony was providing lawmakers with first-hand accounts of systematic dehumanization that many had preferred to ignore or dismiss as necessary discipline. Charlie's transformation demonstrates what's possible when children are treated with basic human dignity, Dr. Sinclair observed to the gathered officials. 18 months ago, he was drinking from animal troughs and being taught that he was inherently worthless. Today, he's advocating for policy changes that will protect thousands of other vulnerable children. But Charlie's success had also attracted criticism from those who insisted that orphan children needed harsh conditioning to prepare them for adult hardships. Warden Price and his supporters continued to argue that Gus's coddling approach would produce young people unable to function in a world that wouldn't show them similar kindness. Mr. Thornfield has created unrealistic expectations in that boy. Price had written in widely circulated critiques of their methods. The real world won't offer orphans clean cups and gentle treatment. We're doing these children a disservice by not preparing them for the harsh reality they'll face as adults. The philosophical battle being waged over Charlie's testimony had implications that extended far beyond individual child placement policies. At stake was the fundamental question of whether society had obligations to its most vulnerable members, or whether survival of the fittest should determine who received protection and opportunity. What Warden Price doesn't understand, explained Professor James Mitchell from the Territorial University, who had been studying the broader implications of institutional reform, is that children who are treated with dignity and respect actually become more resilient adults, not less. They develop internal strength based on self-worth rather than just survival skills based on fear. The ultimate test of everything Gus and Charlie had built together came when the territorial legislature voted on comprehensive child welfare reform legislation that would establish minimum standards for institutional care, require educational opportunities for all orphan children, and create oversight mechanisms to prevent systematic abuse. The Thornfield Act, as supporters called the proposed legislation, faced fierce opposition from institutional operators who argued that regulatory oversight would make orphan care prohibitively expensive and that requiring respectful treatment would undermine necessary discipline. If we pass these regulations, argued Senator Robert Hayes, speaking for the institutional lobby, we'll be forcing taxpayers to provide luxury accommodations for children who should be grateful for whatever shelter and training they receive. Charlie's response to such arguments revealed the moral clarity that had emerged under Gus's mentorship. Senator Hayes, sir, drinking clean water from a cup isn't luxury accommodation. It's basic human dignity that every person deserves, regardless of their age or circumstances. The boy's simple logic, delivered with respectful firmness, exposed the fundamental cruelty of systems that treated basic human needs as privileges to be earned rather than rights to be protected. His testimony was particularly powerful because he spoke from direct experience of both degradation and dignity. When I was forced to drink from the animal trough, Charlie told the legislators, I wasn't learning important lessons about my place in society. I was learning to hate myself and to accept that adults couldn't be trusted to treat children fairly. Those aren't lessons that help anyone become a better person or a more productive citizen. The impact of Charlie's advocacy extended far beyond the legislative hearing room. Newspapers throughout the territory carried stories about the boy who taught dignity, inspiring other communities to examine their own treatment of vulnerable children and challenging long-held assumptions about institutional necessity and effectiveness. Charlie Morrison has given a voice to thousands of children who have suffered in silence, wrote Sarah Wellington in the Denver Herald. His courage in speaking truth about both cruelty and kindness has forced society to confront the difference between discipline and abuse, between preparation for life and destruction of hope. The legislative vote that followed was closer than reformers had hoped, but decisive enough to validate everything Gus and Charlie had worked to achieve. The Comprehensive Child Welfare Reform Bill passed by a narrow margin, establishing the first systematic protections for institutionalized children in the American West. The Charlie Morrison Standards, as the new regulations came to be known, required that orphan children receive clean food and water served with basic dignity, that educational opportunities be provided regardless of family circumstances, and that work assignments be appropriate to age and physical development, rather than simply exploitative. What you've accomplished here extends far beyond policy changes, Dr. Sinclair told Charlie during the celebration that followed their legislative victory. You've proven that society's judgments about human worth are often wrong, and that treating people with dignity allows their true character to emerge. But perhaps the most significant measure of Charlie's transformation came when he was invited to help establish a model institution for orphaned children, one based on respect, education, and preparation for productive citizenship rather than on degradation and submission. The Thornfield Home for Children, as it became known, was designed and operated according to principles Charlie had learned through his own recovery from institutional trauma. Children were treated as individuals with inherent worth. Education was emphasized over punishment, and moral development was encouraged through positive example rather than fear. We want to create a place where children learn they have value, not because they've earned it through submission, but because they're human beings who deserve respect, Charlie explained to visitors who came to observe their innovative approach. Charlie's 13th birthday approached. Gus had been planning a special recognition of the boy's growth and contributions to child welfare reform. The celebration he organized brought together everyone who had been touched by their story: reformed institutional workers, legislative advocates, and dozens of other children whose lives had been improved by the standards Charlie's courage had helped establish. "Ladies and gentlemen," Gus addressed the gathered crowd, "Charlie Morrison represents proof that human potential is unlimited when it's nurtured with dignity and respect. He survived systematic dehumanization and emerged as a leader whose moral courage has changed how our society treats its most vulnerable members." Charlie's response to the recognition revealed the humility and wisdom that had developed under Gus's guidance. "Mr. Thornfield gave me water in his own cup, not because I had earned it, but because every person deserves to be treated with basic dignity. That simple act taught me that I was worthy of respect, and now I want to help other children learn the same lesson." The ceremony that followed included the presentation of a special cup, a replica of the one Gus had used that first day, which would be displayed at the Thornfield home as a symbol of human dignity and the transformative power of simple kindness. "This cup represents more than just clean water," Charlie told the assembled guests. "It represents the difference between treating children as problems to be managed and recognizing them as people with unlimited potential. Every time a child drinks from it, they'll be reminded that they deserve respect, not because of what they've accomplished, but because of who they are." Years later, when historians wrote about the child welfare reforms that transformed institutional care throughout the American West, they would trace their origins to a September day when a rancher offered clean water in his own cup to a boy who had been forced to drink like an animal. The cup itself, preserved at the Thornfield home, became a powerful symbol of human dignity and the obligation of adults to protect rather than exploit vulnerable children. Thousands of young people would drink from it over the years, each receiving the same message Charlie had learned, that every human being deserves to be treated with respect and kindness. "When Mr. Thornfield gave me that cup," Charlie said in his final speech before beginning his studies at the Territorial Teachers College, "he didn't just offer me water, he offered me my humanity back. Now it's my responsibility to make sure other children never lose theirs in the first place." From dehumanized victim to dignified advocate, Charlie's incredible journey proves that one act of basic human kindness can restore hope and transform lives. Gus's simple gesture of offering water in a cup showed that dignity is not earned, but inherent, creating ripples of change that protected thousands of vulnerable children. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of adults who see the humanity in every child and the amazing transformations that occur when we treat all people with the respect they deserve simply for being human.